Cragas, Sicily, approximately 560 BCE. Perilaus was a bronze worker, an artisan who approached Phalaris, the tyrant ruling this wealthy Greek colony, with what he believed was the perfect gift. A hollow bronze bull, life-sized and gleaming, with a door in the side and an acoustic chamber ingeniously designed to transform human screams into sounds resembling a bull's bellowing. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, writing 5 centuries later but drawing from Sicilian sources, Perilaus proudly explained that victims placed inside would cook as fire heated the bronze beneath them, but their agony would emerge as the sweetest music for spectators. Phalaris examined the mechanism with interest. He asked Perilaus to demonstrate how someone would be positioned inside. The bronze worker, eager to show his craftsmanship's sophistication, climbed through the side door to display proper victim placement. Phalaris sealed the door behind him. He ordered servants to light the fire. Inside the bull, Perilaus experienced the death he'd engineered with such care. Bronze conducts heat with ruthless efficiency. Modern metallurgical analysis shows it transfers thermal energy at approximately 109 watts per meter Kelvin. The temperature inside would have risen rapidly as flames licked the bull's bronze belly. At 130 degrees Fahrenheit, human skin begins to burn. At 150, severe blistering occurs. But death doesn't come quickly from heat alone. The bronze didn't heat evenly. Thermodynamic modeling of the described structure shows it would be hottest at the bottom, where Perilaus's feet, buttocks, and lower back pressed against metal that eventually exceeded 300 degrees. He screamed. The acoustic chambers, his own brilliant innovation, transformed his agony into bovine bellowing exactly as designed. From outside, witnesses reported it sounded almost musical. From inside, Perilaus was experiencing what modern burn victims describe as the worst pain the human nervous system can register. Here's what makes this worse. Burns destroy nerve endings, which should eventually reduce pain. But in a large bronze bowl being slowly heated, new areas continuously reached burning temperature, while previously burned areas throbbed with inflammatory response. Modern forensic analysis of burn progression tells us exactly what Perilaus experienced. First-degree burns across his lower body within minutes, progressing to third-degree burns, full-thickness skin destruction, exposing muscle and bone within 10 to 15 minutes. Cause of death combined: hyperthermia, body temperature exceeding 106 degrees Fahrenheit, causes irreversible brain damage with dehydration and eventually suffocation as superheated air seared lung tissue with each desperate breath. The process took 15 to 30 minutes, depending on fire intensity. For most of that time, the victim remained conscious. The brain is one of the last organs to fail. Perilaus heard every note of his own screams, transformed into the music he'd promised Phalaris. Historical accounts differ on whether Phalaris let Perilaus die completely inside the bull or removed him before death to execute him by another method. The Greek writer Lucian claims Phalaris pulled him out while he still lived, then hurled him from a cliff. But all sources agree. Phalaris used the bull extensively afterward, executing enemies and criminals for years. The ironic symmetry wasn't finished. When Phalaris was overthrown in 554 BCE, rebels found the brazen bull among his possessions. They sealed Phalaris inside. They lit the fire. The tyrant who had used Perilaus's creation died exactly as his inventor and his victims had: bronze burning his skin, lungs searing, brain cooking, his screams emerging as animal sounds, while the crowd listened to the music of his agony. At the Battle of the Silarus River in 71 BCE, Spartacus, former gladiator, Thracian warrior, military genius, who led 70,000 slaves in the greatest rebellion Rome ever faced, died fighting. His body was never identified among thousands of corpses littering the battlefield. But 6,000 of his followers were captured alive, by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the general who defeated the slave army and the richest man in Rome. Crassus faced a decision. He could execute them quickly through mass beheading, the efficient method Rome typically used. Instead, he chose crucifixion, all 6,000, simultaneously. Along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a distance of 120 miles. According to the historian Appian, the crosses stood at intervals, creating a forest of torture visible for days of travel. Modern calculations suggest one cross every 100 to 150 feet. The process began with verberatio flogging with a phlegrum. This wasn't a simple whip, but a weapon. Archaeological specimens show a wooden handle attached to multiple leather thongs, embedded with bone fragments, metal balls, and sharp stones called plumbati. The goal was blood loss and shock, but not death wounds deep enough to expose muscle, sometimes bone, creating trauma that would weaken victims for what followed. For these 6,000 men already exhausted by battle and forced marching, the flogging alone killed some. Those who died during verberatio were crucified anyway. The message mattered more than the suffering. Then the patibulum, the crossbeam, weighing 75 to 125 pounds, was tied across their shoulders. They carried it to their execution sites. Those too weak to carry the beam were dragged, skin-tearing on the paved road. At each designated spot along the Appian Way, execution teams worked with practiced efficiency. The condemned was thrown down, arms extended along the patibulum. Here's the crucial detail most people get wrong. Romans didn't nail through palms. They nailed through the wrists, specifically through the space between the radius and ulna bones. Why? Because palms can't support body weight. The tissue tears. The victim falls. The nails clavi were roughly 5 to 7 inches long, square-shafted iron spikes. We know this because in 1968, archaeologists discovered the ossuary of Yehohanan ben Hagkol, a Jewish man crucified around 70 CE. The nail was still embedded in his heel bone, preserved for 2,000 years. When driven through the wrist, these nails typically shattered the median nerve, that electric, nauseating pain shooting up the arm when you hit your funny bone. Except sustained, compressed, constant. The patibulum with attached victim was hoisted onto the vertical stake already planted in the ground. Feet were positioned and nailed, sometimes both feet, with a single nail driven at an angle through the heel bones, based on Yehohanan's remains. Now comes the biomechanical horror. The crucified person hangs with arms extended at roughly 60 to 70 degrees from vertical. This position creates constant tension on the intercostal muscles, the muscles between ribs that help you breathe. In 1986, the Journal of the American Medical Association published forensic analysis of crucifixion mechanics. Their conclusion: breathing in becomes difficult but possible. Breathing out requires pushing up on shattered feet and pulling on nailed wrists. Every breath is a choice to experience excruciating pain in order to survive a few more seconds. The victim enters a cycle: hang and suffocate, push up to breathe, collapse from pain and exhaustion, hang and suffocate. Eventually, after 24 to 72 hours, typically the legs give out permanently. The victim can no longer push up. Carbon dioxide builds up in the blood. Respiratory acidosis sets in. The heart struggles. Finally, consciousness fades and death comes. For Spartacus's 6,000 followers, there was additional torture: the scale. Imagine hanging on a cross, struggling for each breath, and hearing the same struggle from crosses to your left and right, extending in both directions beyond sight. The sound 6,000 men gasping, groaning, crying out would have been psychologically devastating. After 12 to 24 hours, bodily functions ceased to be controllable. After 24 to 48 hours, wounds began attracting insects. Crows pecked at eyes and exposed flesh of the crucified. While they still lived, the Roman poet Horace mentions this detail casually as common knowledge. The crucifixions remained on display for months after the bodies decomposed, until only skeletons hung from crosses. Every slave, every freedman, every person who traveled the Appian Way saw the price of rebellion. There would not be another major slave rebellion in Italy for 400 years. Ancient Persia, approximately 525 BCE, during the reign of Cambyses II. Sisamnes was a royal judge, one of the elite jurists administering Persian law across the empire. He accepted a bribe and issued a corrupt verdict. The details of the case are lost to history. We only know that King Cambyses discovered the corruption and decided to make an example so memorable it would be painted by European artists 2,000 years later. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing less than a century after the event and likely drawing from Persian oral traditions, documents what happened next in his histories. The sentence was flaying, complete removal of the skin while alive. But what makes the Persian method distinct is that executioners were specifically trained to keep Sisamnes conscious throughout the entire process. The executioners began at the extremities, fingers first, not hacking or tearing, but careful incisions along the natural lines where skin separates from subcutaneous tissue, the same lines modern surgeons follow. The technique required sophisticated anatomical understanding. Start at areas with the least blood flow to minimize shock. Use sharp obsidian blades. Geological studies confirm obsidian can be knapped to edges, sharper than modern surgical steel, sometimes just 30 angstroms thick compared to steel's 300. Apply tourniquets at the wrist to control bleeding. Your skin contains approximately 1,300 pain receptors per square inch on your fingertips, decreasing to around 60 per square inch on your back. When you flay someone alive, you're exposing every single one of those nerve endings, called nociceptors, to air, to movement, to touch. Modern pain research shows nociceptor activation creates electrical signals traveling to the brain at speeds up to 120 meters per second. Sisamnes felt every separation of tissue in real time. Herodotus describes the process taking hours. The executioners moved from fingers to hands, then arms, working with methodical care. They peeled skin away in sections, like removing a tight glove. The same technique a butcher uses on an animal carcass. But Sisamnes wasn't dead. He watched. Contemporary accounts don't mention him being gagged. His screams were part of the message. The executioners moved to his chest, peeling skin from his torso. At this point, Sisamnes would have been going into shock, blood pressure dropping, heart rate increasing, breathing rapid and shallow. But Persian executioners understood shock management. They worked in stages, allowing the body to stabilize between sections. Some historical sources suggest they applied crude tourniquets and used cauterization on bleeding vessels to prevent death from blood loss before flaying was complete. Modern medical analysis confirms that a skilled executioner could keep someone alive through flaying of approximately 50 to 60% of body surface. Beyond that, the combination of fluid loss, temperature dysregulation, skin is crucial for maintaining body temperature, and inevitable infection makes death from shock or organ failure almost certain. Sisamnes remained conscious past his hands, past his arms. He felt them peel the skin from his chest. Then his body gave out death from blood loss, shock, or organ failure, once they reached his torso where major blood vessels are impossible to avoid. After Sisamnes died, Cambyses ordered the skin tanned and made into leather strips. Then he upholstered the judge's seat, the actual chair, where judges sat, to render verdicts with Sisamnes's skin. The judge's son, Otanes, was appointed the new judge. He would spend his career rendering verdicts while sitting on his father's skin. This detail appears in Herodotus and was repeated by later historians. The message penetrated Persian legal culture so deeply that judicial corruption reportedly plummeted. One judge's agony became an entire empire's deterrent. His skin, preserved and displayed, ensured his suffering echoed through generations. The story became so famous that in 1498, the Flemish painter Gerard David created the Judgment of Cambyses, showing Sisamnes being flayed alive in graphic detail. It hung in Bruges courthouse for centuries. As a warning, Sisamnes's death served as a deterrent about judicial corruption for more than 2,000 years. The Kingdom of Magadha in ancient India, approximately 400 BCE during the Nanda dynasty. A man his name lost to history but his crime recorded in Sanskrit chronicles as conspiracy against the king was brought before a war elephant. This wasn't random battlefield trampling. This was damnatio ad elephantum, judicial execution by elephant, refined into theater. The practice appears across multiple ancient cultures. Indian kingdoms used it extensively. Carthage adopted it. Rome encountered it through Hannibal. Southeast Asian kingdoms practiced it into the colonial period. The last documented case occurred in Sri Lanka in 1947. But the method's sophistication peaked in ancient India, where elephant training manuals, Hastya Ayurveda texts from the 3rd century BCE include specific protocols for execution training. The elephant is a bull, approximately 10 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing 5 to 6 tons. It has been specifically trained for this purpose by a mahout, an elephant handler who commands through voice, touch, and a hooked stick called an ankus. Archaeological evidence from ancient Indian sites has uncovered specialized training grounds where elephants learned to respond to execution commands. For this conspirator, the king chose prolonged death. The mahout gives the first command. The elephant approaches the condemned man, bound but standing. The elephant's trunk, containing over 40,000 individual muscles, capable of both delicate manipulation and crushing force, wraps around the man's torso. What happens next is reconstructed from multiple historical accounts across different cultures. The elephant squeezes, applying pressure gradually. Human ribs begin to crack, not all at once, but serially, like strings breaking one by one on an instrument. Each fracture is audible. Witnesses consistently describe a sound similar to green wood breaking. The condemned man screams. The elephant, responding to the mahout's commands, maintains pressure just short of full crushing, enough to break ribs and cause excruciating pain, but not enough to immediately collapse the chest cavity. Modern biomechanical analysis tells us human ribs can withstand approximately 520 pounds of lateral force before fracturing. An elephant trunk can exert over 700 pounds. The elephant is being deliberately gentle. The elephant releases. The man collapses, gasping, trying to inflate lungs against a damaged rib cage. He's bleeding internally. Fractured ribs have likely punctured pleural membranes and possibly nicked lung tissue, but he's not yet dying. The elephant receives another command. This time, the elephant places one foot roughly 18 inches in diameter, weighing over a ton when accounting for weight distribution on the man's leg. Not the full weight, controlled pressure. The femur, tibia, and fibula are designed to support vertical compressive loads, but have much less resistance to lateral crushing force. They fracture with that same green wood snapping sound. Here's what makes this worse. The elephant can be instructed to kill slowly or quickly, creating death or merely mutilation as the ruler desires. In documented cases from Southeast Asian kingdoms, elephants were trained to prolong death by systematically crushing extremities, first feet, hands, forearms, lower legs before moving to larger bones. Each crushing carefully calibrated to maximize pain while maintaining consciousness as long as possible. Ancient accounts describe executions lasting 30 minutes to over an hour. The elephant, following sequential commands, would systematically destroy the human body from extremities inward. Sometimes the mahout would order pauses, allowing the victim to fully experience accumulated agony before continuing. Guards ensured family members and suspected co-conspirators watched the entire process. The final command, variations of Mara, meaning death in Sanskrit-derived languages, instructed the elephant to place its full weight on the victim's head or chest. Death was instantaneous. A war elephant's foot delivering 2,000 plus pounds of focused pressure would crush a human skull like an eggshell. But death came only after prolonged torture had served its political purpose. After execution, in some kingdoms, the elephant would be commanded to mutilate the corpse, tearing off limbs, stomping the body into unrecognizable mass, preventing traditional burial, and creating spectacles so horrific that witnesses would be traumatized into compliance for years. Carthage, North Africa, March 7, 203 CE. Vibia Perpetua was a 22-year-old noblewoman, recently married, with an infant son still nursing. She was also a Christian, in an empire that had declared Christianity illegal. When she refused to renounce her faith and sacrifice to the Roman gods, she was condemned to damnatio ad bestias, execution by wild beasts in the amphitheater. We know her story in unusual detail because Perpetua kept a diary during her imprisonment, writing in Latin on whatever materials she could find. The Passio Sanctarum Perpetuae et Felicitatis, the Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, preserves her own words up until the day before her execution, then continues in third-person account by a witness. It's one of the earliest Christian martyr texts and one of the few ancient execution accounts written partially by the victim herself. The Roman amphitheater in Carthage held approximately 30,000 spectators. It was the games celebrating the birthday of Caesar Geta, co-emperor with his brother Caracalla. The crowd expected spectacle, and the governor provided it. Multiple Christians condemned to death by various animals. Perpetua and her companion Felicity, a slave woman who had given birth just days earlier while in prison, were led into the arena. According to the eyewitness account continuing Perpetua's diary, executioners first tried to dress them in robes dedicated to priestesses of Ceres, adding religious mockery to their deaths. The women refused. The executioners relented, allowing them to face death in their own clothing. A wild heifer was released. The Passion notes this detail specifically. A heifer was brought, a most unusual animal for this purpose, chosen so that the women's sex might be matched with that of the beast. The Romans were making a symbolic point: femininity destroyed by femininity. The heifer charged. A mature heifer weighs 800 to 1,200 pounds. When it lowers its head and charges, impact force can exceed 1,500 pounds concentrated at the point of contact. The heifer struck Perpetua first, goring her with its horns and tossing her into the air. She landed hard. The eyewitness account says she was tossed and fell on her back. Modern analysis of cattle goring injuries tells us exactly what this means. Horn penetration into the abdomen or chest cavity, creating puncture wounds 2 to 4 inches deep, internal bleeding, possible organ damage. The kind of injury that would be fatal without modern surgery, but not immediately fatal. Perpetua stood up. The heifer attacked Felicity next, goring and trampling her. Then it turned back to Perpetua. The crowd, according to the account, began to shout that it was enough. Even jaded Roman audiences accustomed to arena violence were disturbed by watching a heifer gore 2 young women, one of whom had given birth days earlier and was still leaking milk. Here's what makes this worse. The animals used in damnatio ad bestias weren't naturally aggressive toward humans. They had to be starved, provoked, sometimes wounded to make them attack. The heifer was probably confused, frightened, reacting to movement and noise rather than hunting prey. This made deaths messier, less predictable, more prolonged than executions by predators like lions. The heifer's second attack knocked Perpetua down again. She was bleeding from multiple goring wounds. The crowd's shouting intensified. The governor ordered the women removed from the arena and taken to the spoliarium, the chamber where wounded gladiators and condemned prisoners were finished off when the spectacle became too disturbing even for Roman audiences. In the spoliarium, a young gladiator was assigned to kill Perpetua with his sword. The eyewitness account provides disturbing details. But the young gladiator's hand trembled. His first thrust was off target, striking her between the ribs, but missing vital organs. Perpetua screamed. Then, according to the account, she took the wavering hand of the young gladiator and guided it to her throat. Even in death, reduced to guiding a sword to her own neck because the executioner was too nervous to kill her cleanly, Perpetua maintained agency. The second thrust severed her carotid artery. She died within seconds from blood loss and likely stroke as blood pressure to the brain dropped catastrophically. Felicity died similarly, finished by gladiators after surviving the heifer's attack. Their bodies were buried by fellow Christians in catacombs beneath Carthage. The passion of Perpetua and Felicity was copied and distributed across the Christian world, becoming one of the most influential martyr texts. Perpetua's diary, her own words, survived because prisoners smuggled it out before her execution. The irony: Rome used damnatio ad bestias to destroy enemies. Instead, Perpetua's execution created a martyr whose story would be read for 1800 years. Rome, 104 BCE. The Second Servile War, another massive slave uprising, this time in Sicily, had dragged on for 3 years. When it finally ended, the Roman general Manius Aquilius captured the rebel leader Athenian and thousands of his followers alive. According to the Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, writing about 40 years later, Aquilius faced logistical problems: too many prisoners to execute efficiently, and executing them in Italy would require transporting thousands of captives across the sea. Instead, he made a decision revealing something about Roman values. He would make the executions profitable. The captured rebels were sent to Rome to fight as bestiarii, condemned criminals forced to fight wild animals in the arena as public entertainment. Here's the disturbing detail Diodorus records. These particular prisoners refused to fight. They refused to provide the spectacle Romans expected. Roman authorities had invested significant money in capturing these slaves, transporting them, and advertising the games. The crowd wanted blood. The prisoners' refusal was both financial loss and public embarrassment. The solution reveals the Roman mindset. If the prisoners wouldn't entertain by fighting, they would entertain by starving. The prisoners were confined without food or water, not in private cells but in public view, in the holding areas beneath the arena where spectators could watch them slowly dying. Death by starvation is agonizing and prolonged. Modern medical understanding of starvation's progression. After 24 to 72 hours without food, the body depletes glucose reserves and begins converting fat to ketones for energy. After a week, fat reserves diminish and the body begins consuming its own muscle tissue, including heart muscle. After 2 weeks, organ function begins failing. Death typically comes after 30 to 70 days of complete starvation, though with dehydration, the timeline accelerates. But starvation doesn't just hurt physically, it creates psychological changes. Extreme hunger produces obsessive thoughts about food, hallucinations, aggression, and breakdown of moral constraints. The death of one prisoner in particular struck Diodorus as worth documenting. The man, desperate from thirst and hunger, began to kill and eat his cellmates. Think about the horror of this scene. A man so desperately hungry that he murders his fellow prisoners, men he'd fought alongside, comrades who'd shared the risks of rebellion, and consumes their flesh while crowds of Romans watch from above. The Romans didn't intervene to stop this. They watched it as entertainment. The prisoner who turned cannibal wasn't simply evil. He was experiencing the documented psychological effects of starvation. His brain, literally running out of fuel, had degraded to the point where survival instinct overwhelmed every other consideration. The Romans knew this would happen. They'd created conditions specifically designed to make prisoners desperate enough to provide the spectacle of killing each other. When he died, Diodorus doesn't specify how long it took. only that he eventually died after consuming many of his fellow prisoners. His death was considered successful entertainment. The other prisoners from the Second Servile War died, similarly starved to death in public view, or forced into animal fights they'd initially refused. None of their names survived. We don't know how many died this way. Diodorus mentions them as a group, remarkable only because one of them became a cannibal. The irony. These men had rebelled seeking freedom from slavery. They'd fought for years, killed Roman citizens, briefly controlled significant territory. Their punishment wasn't just death, it was reduction to entertainment, their final suffering commodified for profit and public amusement. Even in death, Rome found a way to extract value from slaves' bodies. This execution reveals Rome's sophistication in psychological torture, not just physical pain, but degradation so complete that victims became monsters in their final moments, validating Roman narratives about slaves' inherent savagery, while Rome itself orchestrated the conditions that created the horror. The spectators went home entertained. The message was received. Rebellion leads not just to death, but to transformation into something less than human, something that justifies its own destruction.